The Final Girls is a wonderful homage to 80s horror films, with one fatal flaw. For some unbegod's known reason, they decided to rate it PG-13. Now, I'm not one of those people that automatically dismisses PG-13. There's a ton of great PG-13 movies out there. But if you saw my video from a while ago where I talk about how there were a lot of movies that were initially supposed to be R, but they dialed them back to be PG-13. And that's kind of what it feels like here. But let me go into it a little bit more. First off, if you're a horror fan, absolutely see this movie. Without spoiling anything, a young girl gets transported Last Action Hero style into a horror movie. Now the thing is, her mother used to be a scream queen, so she gets teleported into her mother's most famous movie. And the meta stuff starts there. They have the horror aficionado there who's talking about all the different tropes and all the different cliches and whatnot that are in the movie. And it does a really good job of deconstructing the genre. It makes so many references to different movies. You got Friday the 13th, you got Nightmare on Elm Street, and even Pieces. They had a Pieces reference in there. So when they wrote this, they did their homework. There's a ton of very funny moments in it. I thought that it might end up getting a little cringy, but there wasn't anything in there that I didn't like. The humor was spot on, and the violence did push it a bit. It did feel like they were touching the edges of PG-13, but then there were certain times they absolutely were holding back. And that's where my problem comes in. You've got a movie called The Final Girls that is about the horror staple of The Final Girl, and it's basically a huge homage to the slashers of the 80s. What did those movies have? They had violence and nudity. And in this, they goofed on the violence and they goofed on the nudity. I was fine with that, but the problem was that almost every time, you could tell they were holding back. And it didn't make it as effective as it would have been if it was R-rated. The nudity, fine. It didn't need to be there because there was a humorous part with nudity that they took out that it would have been funny either way. But I'm talking about the violence. There were stabbings and gorings and all this kind of stuff, and not even a splurt of blood. At those times, it felt like you were watching a made-for-TV movie, which also makes this all the more unusual because it was a video-on-demand title. Now, with PG-13 in theaters, I understand. They're putting the movie out in PG-13 so they can get more asses in the seats, fine. And then usually when it hits home video, if it was shot as R and then they dialed it back to PG-13, they'll release the unrated cut and then you can see the movie as it was intended. But with this, it was straight to video and it was PG-13. So it makes me wonder if the movie was supposed to go theatrical, but then for whatever reason, they decided to go straight to video and they left the rating on there. The movie as it is still fantastic. It's a great, highly entertaining horror movie that if you're a fan of horror, if you love old 80s slashers, even if you love the 90s slashers, you'll still get a lot of enjoyment out of this. But the rating prevents it from being a horror comedy classic like Shaun of the Dead, Cabin in the Woods, or even Evil Dead 2. I mean, could you imagine Evil Dead 2 PG-13? How not funny that would be? Don't misunderstand me. I really like the movie. They did a terrific job, and I do hope that there's actually an R-rated version out there, because that would absolutely bump it up into horror comedy classic.